This is episode 687 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, things continue to develop up in the Santa Fe and the legislature, and sometimes they're acceptable. Sometimes they're not such great developments, mostly on the not so great side of things. The latest is HB 11, paid family leave, passed 38 to 31 up in the New Mexico House of Representatives. Now, this is no longer technically paid family and medical leave. We have a new name for the bill, and it is a welcome family. Let's see. Oh, goodness. It's a new welcome family tax credit, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, I got so many things rattling around up here. Welcome Child and Family Wellness Leave Act. All right. So rather than 12 weeks for everybody, it's 6 weeks for regular illnesses, 12 weeks for children born or adopted, $3,000 a month child refund up to for 3 months, and that's
A refund of
$9,000.
what? That's the
Good question.
okay. So yeah, but anyway,
Same taxes, same problems for businesses. A handful of Democrats did vote against it, but obviously not at the level necessary in order to defeat it. Patty Lundstrom being one of the prominent Democrats who opposed the bill, and let's see, Cynthia Borrego exempt. I don't know all the names offhand. I'm reading a list that doesn't have the partisan names, but it was more or less the Democrats in the House did support it. So it goes on to the New Mexico Senate, and it'll probably have a hearing or so before it gets to the floor. And last time around, and kind of as a general rule, the Senate has been the easier of the two to pass these kinds of schemes through. So we'll see if that holds this particular time. And of course, we've talked about the governor, and she has some concerns about this particular legislation, but we'll see. So, Senate Tax, Business, and Transportation Committee, it is there. It has not been heard yet, but that's the committee that it's going to head to in the New Mexico Senate. So,
yeah, Paul. There's a few things about that bill that are a little problematic. One, it's not anywhere close to even being finished as a bill,
right.
much less as a program. There,
The
there.
funding is particularly a
Well, yeah,
concern. Solvency,
they haven't
yeah.
said okay. So there's two pieces, and neither one of them works very well. One, the half that's paid in by employers and employees, the so-called largest tax increase in the history of New Mexico. Yeah, it goes bankrupt according to the fiscal impact report in a couple years. The other, that 9,000, 3,000 a month for 3 months to families with new children, there's scant even information about where that's going to come from. So it is interesting. One that I think it's interesting it passed in its current form, and heck, this is New Mexico. Well, and not to pick on New Mexico, maybe we have to pass it to see what's in it, but maybe they passed it knowing that it wasn't complete, and they're going to count on the Senate now to finish this bill out to where it would even be implementable as a public policy.
Yeah, I think the solvency issue, holistically, and that's what we try to do at the Rio Grande Foundation. We certainly respect what businesses have to say. We respect the interest of businesses, and we always have the backs of businesses that are not tied to the government teat and government spending and credits and subsidies.
All 12 of them in New Mexico.
Ultimately, we care about the taxpayers of the states. We care about good governance as a broader rule. And that's not to say that we disagree with the businesses on this particular issue in any way, shape, or form. It's just if I had to point to one specific issue that I think should concern New Mexicans at large, if you're not a small business owner, et cetera, it is the very dubious solvency issue. The idea that we're putting the camel's nose under the tent, and then they're going to ratchet those taxes up, ratchet where that money comes from to keep this fund afloat. We don't know any of that information yet. State Investment Council is going to be investing the money in this fund. If they have a bad year or two, the stock market goes down, where does that money come from? It is not even contemplated in this legislation. Right. And there's numerous, half-baked would be a kind word to use for this particular bill.
Yes, it would insult fractions and bakers at this point.
Exactly. Well, that is obviously a real downer and something that we are obviously going to be working to push back against in any way, shape, or form. And, it is very much, just because they got over the hurdle that is the House, and they didn't last year, doesn't mean that they're going to simply roll this thing through. So you just never know in the roundhouse. It is a crapshoot, to say the least, and emphasis is on crap and the shoot part of this equation. So
the only gun controls we don't have in New Mexico relate to our crapshoots. So
there was a bill just today that I had the pleasure, so to speak, of testifying on. It was HB 548, yet another attack on the oil and gas industry, another attempt to increase taxes on that particular industry. They use the somewhat benign sounding term Oil and Gas Equalization Act, like there is some kind of great disparity of tax rates between things like oil and natural gas, and just another revenue grab that there's been kicked up, that they've been able to cook up in Santa Fe. Nathan Small and Meredith Dixon on this particular proposal. And Dixon is one of those people who, and I could go through the murderer's row of all the different legislators and kind of analyze them. But she's one of the more interesting Democrats up there in the sense that she does have some good ideas. She's not one of those universally wrong people, especially around energy, but she really has a very hard left progressive voting record. And, when push comes to shove on almost every issue, including energy, she tends to vote the wrong way. And it's this bill is not a good piece of legislation. It would be very harmful. So it was the only bill heard in the tax committee, so it did slow the works down. But it's just a real bad piece of legislation.
And is that the one to raise the royalty rate on state trust
That's
lands?
a different land.
Okay, now what's this one raise tax on?
This is it is just so let's see. I'll read the brief summary from the financial impact report. It imposes a new privilege tax, so a new tax on the severance and sale of oil in New Mexico. The tax is set at 0.85% of the taxable value of these products.
Yeah, so we already have a severance tax, but that's not enough. So we need another severance tax.
Yeah, so it's a brand new tax, which, when you look at the Freedom Index, we have people ask all the time, we have the Freedom Index, and I'm going to talk about that at some length next. People ask us about our methodology. Well, there are a lot of different components that go into it. Is it a good or bad bill? First and foremost, that's obviously a big part of it. Is it something that is going to do harm once, or is this going to be harmful for a very long time? Is this a new tax that will likely be permanent and increased into the future, or is this a tax reduction or tax cut? All things being equal, we would rather have a tax cut rather than a rebate. For example, if you're talking about good pieces of legislation, this one is a bad new tax, so we give it a -6. It's not as big in terms of the revenue impact as some other taxes, but it definitely has the potential to grow into the future and as a new source of revenue. Grover, our friend Grover Norquist likes to say that, you know, when government has one needle stuck in your arm and they're sucking your blood out, that is a problem. And they can increase the size and the scope of what they're taking out of you. But once you start putting more and more needles in, that's when you really start to have problems. So this would just be another needle stuck into the state's economy, the oil and gas industry. We, of course, do not believe that the state is effectively using the money, considerable resources, $61 billion to be exact, that's stored up, let alone the money that's, spent every single year. We just don't see the money being spent effectively and for the benefit of the people of New Mexico. So, it would be an interesting proposition if we genuinely thought that the royalties or the taxes on oil and gas, say New Mexico had the lowest net tax burden on the
Yeah,
oil and
way
gas
too
industry.
low,
Yeah,
lower than everybody.
and we said, well, and the state was planning to use that money for some kind of tax reduction or something that would benefit the people of New Mexico at large. That would be a tough thing for us to analyze. I'm sure we could analyze it, but it would be much tougher. This is very easy.
Well, a couple of things. One, we have the gross receipts tax, and the gross receipts tax hurts every industry.
Yep.
And so, if you're going to be looking at, severance taxes and production taxes between Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, keep in mind that, yeah, we're fine. We're in the ballpark with those other states, some a little higher, some a little lower. But we have the gross receipts tax where we tax services, and there's a lot of services that go into generating oil and gas. So that's one thing. And so, yeah, equalization. Uh, if the equalization of the oil and gas or the business taxes had some sort of gross receipts tax reduction in it, you can maybe call it equalization. Now, Paul, I do want to call to your attention the fact that it's called equalization shows that it's probably the most unequal thing in the world. We are still under the emergency school tax in the oil and gas industry. And I apologize, I don't have the exact date. That's going on, 20, 30 years we've had an emergency. And so when will things be equal under this new tax? The answer is never. Just makes it, they have a good talking point, but yeah, they want more money and they think they can get it from the oil and gas industry. And
we are having an emergency in education, Wally, but
not education funding.
Not education funding, just educational performance, which really says all you need to know about education policy.
Yeah, it's
right?
It's not the money; it's how it's spent. So yeah, this is. And I know. Excuse me. I love the Laffer curve. Where are we on the Laffer curve on this? At some point, I think that maybe this tax won't make a huge difference, but it comes to a point where you get a lot less money than you would have otherwise. And that talk about tough things to prove. But if we go this direction that we seem to be going in New Mexico about taxing business and making things tough to do, I think we might see that in our lifetime. A real noticeable shift away from our state with oil and gas.
Yeah. So looking at the Freedom Index, and this is where stuff really starts to get fun and interesting with the Freedom Index. We've still got just about 3 weeks left in the legislative session, but we're starting to see the votes pile up. And right now, the House, as a general rule, has higher scores than the Senate. The Senate has taken some votes that, from a conservative perspective, there were some votes that were tough on folks. It just some things were not caught and fully vetted before they got voted, and I think that was a strategic proposition by Senate leadership. But uh, John Block, no surprise there, has the most overall points at 67. We have Alan Martinez at 66, as well as Randall Pettigrew at 66. So some pretty solid, positive scores there. Let's see, Andrea Reeb as well, Representative Andrea Reeb. So she also is at 66. In terms of some of the votes that are really critical here that we're looking at, there are, of course, on the House side, you got to look at both because they're voting on different pieces of legislation, especially at this point. But let me pull this up. So we've got votes that are being factored in here to the index. And I'm not going to go through all of these. One is HB 89. Bill, and these are descriptions that I've inserted into this legislation. It's -6, amends Graduate Scholarship Act to give priority in award of funding to students from groups underrepresented in the graduate education, and removes the requirement that recipients be a U.S. citizen or have permanent resident visa. So now we're going to be subsidizing college graduate scholarships for people who aren't even citizens of the United States. So that's a -6. HB 339, and these have been voted on the floor. So these are real threats to move forward. This bill, HB 339, expands New Mexico's Human Rights Act to provide more comprehensive protections against housing discrimination, specifically focusing on sources of income and screening process. And I believe this is the one that prohibits renters from treating Section 8 differently from anybody else. HB 128 creates a fund to subsidize local agencies developing solar projects. So there's just a list of these. You could go through them yourself, click on your legislator or any legislator. Those are some House votes. I won't go through all the Senate and House votes, but yeah, there's a lot of bad things that aren't getting the level of attention of HB 11. There's a few good bills. A few have even gotten votes on the floor of one house or the other. But please do check out this information. It is dynamic. We are, votes are coming in every day. We're still adjusting ratings and adding bills based on conversations and discussion and looks at those bills. But I stand behind the Freedom Index, and I've heard from legislators themselves that they are not they're not in disagreement with us on those particular bills that we've rated.
Yeah, Paul, and you may disagree with this characterization, but when I look at the Freedom Index, how it plays out in New Mexico, so many of the bills that get negatives are something that tries to overcome market conditions explicitly. So a good example would be like we have a nurse shortage because we have horrendous malpractice insurance charges here. It makes it tough for healthcare providers to stay here. So instead of address the underlying economic issue, we're going to pass a bill that says there has to be more nurses at a facility. And that just so often...
Abracadabra.
Abracadabra. And if the magic wand worked ever, Maybe it does. Maybe we'll get lucky someday. But a lot of the things that we try to do, and just one like the housing vouchers. So we have housing shortages. We have labor problems, we have material problems, we have taxation problems, we have impact fees. You have to build EV chargers. We have lots of things that make it tough to build build apartments, build housing, whether it's low income or not. But we have this one little thing, and so let's just make it that, and so yeah, the magic wand is alive and well in Santa Fe, I guess is what I'm saying. And as we look back, a lot of times it does not work out too well. And another example, I don't know where this bill is the Medicaid for all bill. It's like right at the time, and I think this maybe has got the wind out of its sails because the federal government might not give us all the money that they've given us in the past. The more people we add to Medicaid, if I said Medicare the first time, I meant Medicaid. So yeah, just magic wand thinking. And does it work out? Every now and then, but overall, it's been a tough history. We're not last at most things as a state because our state policies have been working out well. That's the bottom line.
I would agree with your characterization of the Freedom Index and really kind of the work of the Rio Grande Foundation at large, in the sense that we are fighting for the reality based world,
Yeah,
and
as
the
opposed
entire
to the political
the
or make
entire
believe.
apparatus of the New Mexico legislature and this governor are trying to fight for a non-reality based world. And so what they do is weave a whole governance structure of subsidies and regulations and taxes and tax breaks and refundable credits and the whole nine yards.
And,
Everything
and,
that we
and a story around it, a sweet
right,
story that it
right.
all is good. There's no downside.
Our view would be that you let the government let the market work by and large, and then if there are issues where something that we view as a society that is critically important is not happening, then we address it. Now, we believe that regulations on pollution and whatnot makes sense. Uh, for example,
Everything makes sense up to a point.
yes, there's got to be some amount of all kinds of government policies, but it's a little bit like the Laffer curve. You don't want to go too far down the you know when you're starting to have more negative impacts than positive impacts. That's when we try to stop the brakes and see where we can go. And we're well down the curve in terms of
Yeah.
the way government operates in New Mexico. Overwhelmingly, you could probably find one or two cases where there's not the correct amount, not enough regulation in some ways, but in the other 100,000 or million or whatever cases, there's way too much government regulation, and it's a net detriment to overall prosperity and conditions in our state. So very very astute there, Wally. So on a interesting note, I posted something. I thought I might get a bit of a reaction out of this because unlike the typical thing that we talk about, which is the actual policies of Santa Fe, I wrote something up and talked about the process. And I said the process in Santa Fe stinks. Not literally, but the process is not very good for small d democracy and the way that the legislature hears and doesn't hear bills. For example, today, and actually the tax committee is probably one of the very best run committees in the legislature, the House Tax Committee. And I've testified that, as you can imagine. I'm a regular, kind of like Cheers. They're they're at the House Tax Committee, but uh, today they had a very lengthy discussion on this oil and gas tax bill. So they only got around to one bill. No harm, no foul. It's just the way it is. But if you were traveling to Santa Fe to be heard on some of these other plans that were up in the legislative in this committee, there were a total of three bills. You were just SOL. You have to come back now on Wednesday and waste your entire day if theoretically you can do that. Now, that's a problem for me. That's a huge problem if you're a business owner, if you're an average citizen who has a lot of things going on and they're not taking a paycheck from, an organization that's paying them to work on some of these issues. Now that's one, albeit relatively limited issue. The others are, the limits. First 10 people to the microphone in a room where 42 people raised their hand and said they're on one side, and so you set up a literal stampede of people. Imagine, the lawsuit in waiting to the state of New Mexico for somebody who either gets injured, trampled literally, or somebody who's trying to testify on disability rights related issues and they can't even get to the microphone because they're in a wheelchair or they're handicapped in some way, shape, or form. So that's one. Limited to a minute. It's very hard to get anything across to somebody in a minute. Zoom testimony is both limited in terms of the number of people allowed to testify and just I think the staff and the technology don't lend themselves particularly well to being noticed. Raise your Zoom hand, Wally. That can be a very fraught process.
Well, yeah.
And the bill's shifted.
Your
Yeah,
microphone's muted.
Yeah, well, that one pretty. Most people who have done it a time or two understand, that something's going to flash up on the screen. It is an intimidating process for even somebody who has done it a few times. But Wally, any thoughts on that?
Yes. The founders of New Mexico did not think that we needed as many laws as our legislators think that we need. I just want to go on record as saying I'm pretty much with our founding fathers of New Mexico when the Constitution of New Mexico is written. I don't think we need longer sessions. I don't think we need more bills. I do think that there ought to be actual real work done in these interim committees to gain some background on some of these issues. Because, they spend months and months and months traveling around the state of New Mexico, holding meetings in various committees on various topics. But when it comes down to it, they come to the legislative session and the bills that get drafted are half thought out, or they're like the paid family medical leave. They don't even have the basics in them. And so something is broken. There is no question about it. But I do want to go on record as saying, man, we don't need a longer legislative session because back to the trying to pass magical bills that tend to not have a net positive benefit for the people of New Mexico. That's what a lot of the legislation is. Now, I don't know how to do that other than beg and cajole the leadership to say, okay, why don't we set some priorities and not move these less important bills over time. Maybe that's the way to do it. But to date, we've had Democrats for a long time in New Mexico. We had 2-year period where the Republicans were in charge, but that I don't think that's enough to even say they ran the meetings differently. But because they just had one house of the legislature, it wasn't like you saw a huge big difference. But yeah, the process about what they do, and man, maybe they always try to pass you can't drink in the Capitol. Maybe they should not be able to drink as much as they're drinking at the interim meetings and maybe pay attention and do a little bit more work. And they'd be ready to come to Santa Fe raring to go with some background and some work, as opposed to they almost wake up in a new world every day. You get the feeling of that when you're up there. I have over the years.
Well, I do think a limit on the number of bills per legislator that can be introduced is worthwhile, even if they wanted to I don't know, say 10 bills, 2 amendments, and a memorial. I don't know. I'm just throwing numbers out there. Even give the majority, give the Democrats a couple extra bills.
Yeah, we need Espanola Mariachi Day. We can't get rid of that because that's making New Mexico
Right.
great. So,
Right. So those are some of the reforms. I mean, I've also thought about, in my fantasy world, that if I actually had sane, say I'm the governor and I am trying to actually reform New Mexico with a reform-minded legislature, I'm going to do my best jawboning because I don't have control over the legislative branch. It's a separate
yes.
branch of government, but I would get
Except
them.
during COVID, you do. But
That's true. I would get them all in a room and say, "Hey guys, we have perhaps one legislative session, one cycle to do what we need to do here in terms of reforms." So I say, look, guys, let's put our best reform bills forward and try like heck to make sure that those get heard and that they move through the process and that it's a fair process. Nobody can complain about it. But at the end of the day, we have 5, 10, maybe 15 real priorities. Now, the Democrats have been in charge for so long that nobody knows any differently. Quite frankly, unfortunately, when the Republicans were in power in the House for that 2-year
yeah.
window, they didn't really change the process, except,
They showed up on time.
well, they did that, uh, except as the expert witness for the right to work bill. They took every testimony that was available for the entire 7 hours
Yeah.
that I was sitting there. They were on the House floor in a committee, so they were using,
Yeah.
because of the size
A
of the
committee
number
of
of
the
people.
whole sort
Yeah.
of.
Well, they
Oh,
were just
they-
using the room. They were just
Yeah.
using the
Oh,
room.
I see. Because so
'Cause-
many people were
yeah.
for or against it.
Yeah. So there are ways to make things work. And that's one of the other issues, is that sometimes there's committee rooms. Some of those rooms, I mean, the Roundhouse is such a bizarre building to begin with. And that you have some rooms that are really teeny tiny little bandboxes, and you have a really controversial bill. So how do you get into the room and testify on that? It's a mess. It's a real tough situation. And it's not an ideological thing per se. It is definitely a process thing. I mean, I do think the Democrats game the process on the margins in order to benefit their own priorities, but they also don't have a set of priorities that they are urgent about because they've controlled things for so many decades.
Well, and then I don't know if this next idea of mine, I may not like it myself. So I'll put it out there
Oh
with
boy.
that. Paul, like when you go to a county commission or a city council, sometimes they'll have things on the so-called consent agenda where we've already talked about this, everyone's in agreement, we don't need to beat it to death. Now, I don't think that that's a place for big things to go, but the consent agenda would mean that overwhelming majorities of the Democrats and the Republicans during the interim have said, not that this idea that a bill that's, heaven forbid, drafted during the interim is the right bill to deal with this, and we put this one on the important but uncontroversial path, maybe something like that, because that's the other thing that, believe me, it's the big rocks that are the frustration with legislation coming out of Santa Fe. But every now and then, there's an important piece of little legislation that just doesn't get dealt with. And it hurts people, because everyone agrees, but it just gets caught up, as you say, in the gamesmanship and brinksmanship of how they manage the clock in such a short session. So maybe that's an idea too. And again, I'm thinking that not enough work's being done at the and these interim committees. It's too much of a dog and pony show, and not again focused enough on the important issues and spending time, with real witnesses on both sides of these issues, kind of getting the information out there so they'd be better prepared at the session. Because every now and then there's a surprise, but how many times has it been a total surprise what we need to spend time on in the legislature? It's not one big bill in 20 or 30 or 100. It's a very small percentage.
Yeah. All right. So moving forward, the governor has said that she will hold a special session. We don't have obviously time information on that, but her concern is budget cuts in Washington D.C. The Trump administration, of course, Doge, etc. I don't real, cutting through both the language and kind of just the broader statements and looking at this as a reality, budgetary situation. The Trump administration, their new energy secretary has already said the labs are not going to be impacted. What we, I believe, are really talking about, and I mean the governor, Rio Grande Foundation, Trump, etc., is Medicaid. That is that is what the governor is concerned about, and understandably so, considering New Mexico's highest in the nation rate of Medicaid dependency, the fact that it's 15.5 billion with a B dollars, a 27% jump from FY25 to FY26, assuming that the budget passes with all of this. So this is a huge increase in Medicaid spending. Now, what will they do? It is an open question. How much will the Trump administration try to save and cut out of Medicaid in the near future to the point where a special session would really be necessary?
Yeah, and
All of
then
these
what's the
questions.
timing?
Yeah,
I will uh, just say between 3 months, let's say 3 months, is it more likely to happen before 3 months or after? It's like I think we're putting the cart before the horse. It's like it could be a year or more before anything really started to trickle down that would require a special session of the New Mexico legislature.
yeah. So I don't know what exact situation the governor's trying, dealing with, why she's already coming out with this proposal. So, but let's dig. I want to dig into the Medicaid thing a little bit. I mentioned some of the top line numbers. Legislative Finance Committee says 47% of the state's population is on Medicaid. But check this data out there here, Wally. So in fiscal year 2023, uh, the state and federal governments combined to spend $9.1 billion essentially on Medicaid. The current request for fiscal year 2026 is $15.5 billion in Medicaid. I mean, the AP reported it's a 27% increase year over year. It's an absolute uh, machine, the amount of money that is being poured into Medicaid. Now, I think we're looking fairly good at this point that Medicaid forward, maybe they'll include it in the tax bill or something, but I can't see the bill itself. I'm hoping that that doesn't pass, and I don't think that Trump would fund it if it did pass. But boy, Medicaid is compiling a huge and growing portion of New Mexico's budget, and you just wonder for what. And there's one specific thing that I wanted to share. So in 2024, and this is directly from a Albuquerque Journal article, New Mexico adopted the Health Care Delivery and Access Act. And I was at a Republican luncheon where the head of the New Mexico Hospital Association spoke, and uh, I'll talk about that in a second. Uh, so the state, this is quoting from the Journal, the state law passed last year will assess a tax on hospitals, a larger tax on big hospitals. They'll pool it, leverage those funds for a federal Medicaid match, then bring home $1.5 billion in a total additional funding back to New Mexico to provide sustainable reimbursement to our state's hospitals. So you're essentially manipulating the Medicaid system and the fact that the federal government picks up about 73% of the tab and using this tax to bring in more money to the state that they then reimburse and share with predominantly the rural hospitals and the poorer hospitals, and then get the bigger hospitals less of a share, but it's all a means of fleecing the federal government. If this ain't going to happen, but if Medicaid or any health care program for the poor were to be funded exclusively at the state level, it would work completely differently than what Medicaid does. Medicaid is a broken program that is it's the federal government encouraging states and handing them free cash to often use to get more free cash.
Right. And, Paul, it's not a term I use frequently, but this is literally a Ponzi scheme because what happens, we're going to tax ourselves, we're going to spend more, but then the feds are going to spend more. But that only works when Medicaid grows. It can't grow past 100%. And we're already at very high levels. And hopefully we'll still have people that aren't on Medicaid here in a few years. But this sounds like the sort of thing that, I don't know. I call it a marijuana business plan. It's like some people said, you know what would be a good idea? Why don't we do this? Oh man, that just strikes me as a very reckless, very dangerous approach. But as you've said many times, it's amazing. New Mexico likes getting money from the feds. That is our. We don't have a pro sports franchise here, but we do have a pro sport, and that's trying to get money out of the federal government. So
Yeah, that is the case actually, and it seems like the legislature would almost rather New Mexico be poor in order to keep that money flowing in from Washington than rebuild our economy and be a strong, relatively prosperous, self-sustaining state. Every state gets federal dollars, but we are among the greatest recipients of those dollars relative to other states. So it's like, guys, you're missing the game here. And of course, the real game is what gets them reelected, and I think that's the ultimate problem. Last item, this Saturday, I will be spending some time with the folks at Americans for Prosperity, and anyone who wants to attend, lunch will be catered. 11:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. We'll be talking taxes. That is March 8th, for those who don't know, and the information is available at heirsofenchantment.com. I will be talking about the tax structure in New Mexico and tax reform. The Americans for Prosperity will be presenting on the Trump tax cuts and what we need to do to move those forward here in Congress. You can find out more information again at heirsofenchantment.com, but you can RSVP to Bobby Curtis from Americans for Prosperity, 505-385-5564 by March 6th. So if you're interested in taxes and what we should be doing in New Mexico in the area of tax reform, come out on Saturday, 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. And really quickly on that note, there's an interesting chart that I found on social media, and it talks about which taxes damage growth the most. And it's actually fairly consistent that pound for pound, the corporate income tax is the most harmful. Second is personal income tax. Third is a consumption tax, and fourth is the property tax. Now, I know people dislike the property tax arguably the most, but that's actually one of the reasons why property taxes are less harmful. That and they're essentially a wealth tax. The Democrats don't portray their wealth taxes in that way, but um, you know, corporate income tax, you're targeting businesses that you theoretically want to come into your state for taxation. You get more of what you tax less, you get less of what you tax more. Personal income tax. Now, consumption tax, it'd be interesting to see some real economic write-ups as to whether the gross receipts tax qualifies as a consumption tax or how much it's a consumption tax or
yeah,
a business tax. But
I would say, just based on what I know about it, I'm not sure what the definition is, but I have a feeling that percentage is very high. It has a 80-90% correlation to a consumption tax just because it touches so many things in New Mexico.
yeah, it's definitely a a tricky one when it comes to taxation in New Mexico relative to other states. All
Well,
right.
and we get under the radar of a lot of people's analyses because it is kind of a special tax that a lot of people don't have, so they don't even know how to deal with it a lot of times.
Yep.
I think it helps us in some of these 50 state rankings. I think if they understood the
Right.
gross receipts tax, it'd even be worse.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.